The topic before us is pastoral accountability. Pastoral accountability is something which is near and dear to my heart because of my Catholic roots. Around the early 2000s, the Boston Globe report was released, shaking the entire Western world, and really the entire world generally, regarding the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. I am in full liberty to publicly reveal the effects which this had on many communities which I was engaged with in my formative years, undergoing catechesis, the introduction of the sacrament of the Eucharist, confirmation, etc. There were many young people who were instantly pulled from their catechesis classes. Many parishes that were thriving in Ireland that families had visited dried up almost within a week or two. There were calls to become Anglicans or Episcopalians, not over deep theological issues, but precisely because of honest, sincere, and true encounters with a hierarchy that had betrayed the confidence of many in the laity and feelings and experiences of betrayal. These were very real experiences that moved friends and loved ones and still moves and affects loved ones. 2019 saw the Summer of Shame, where ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, a cardinal of the Church, was finally revealed to be the perpetrator of horrible crimes. And it was that time that saw the abandonment of seemingly more progressive parishes and the advent of the rise of the new Latin Mass, which was perceived to be the root of a community that took issues of accountability seriously. This perception, whether right or wrong, was reflected, however, not just in an exodus to those traditional communities with which I am still in communication, even if I'm no longer a formal member, but also in the revelation that there were allegations of abuse there as well. All of this is public knowledge, but it did imminently and personally affect many who were friends and colleagues and still are. My own emotional experience rested in trying to communicate that none of these horrible crimes invalidated the truth of the gospel. But many saw it as a sign that this hypocrisy among the followers of Jesus only indicated that perhaps this call to follow and imitate the Master was something meant for the clouds and not for the earthy realities of we human beings. Naturally, I believe fervently that the horrible, horrible deeds that were committed in no way invalidates the truth of the Word. And I will say I have been proud to see systems of great accountability in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, for which I'm very proud. And I will also say that there are steps being made in all of these hierarchies. But it just goes to show the personal effects of a lack of accountability can have on a larger church body in the world. One observation from class that I'm asked to give stood out to me, and that was the beginning, where you, Dr. Swain, read from the ordination of ministers or priests, I believe from the ELCA, so in this case, pastors, and the call to essentially act as the voice of one who hears and accompanies those who walk in pain. And our class discussions, as I am going to discuss from our readings here, about the limitations of confidentiality, how that all primarily functions. I am very impressed by our discussions of Greenleaf, and particularly in the show, how the pastoral accountability is somewhat undone by nepotism in the family, or totally undone by nepotism. This is fundamentally true, and I can fundamentally report that although this problem seems to be on the surface a work of fiction, as many have pointed out in our course, without giving any, of course, sensitive details, there are indeed situations in parishes where either family ties or friendship ties lead to a lack of accountability structures. This is only further evidence to me of the profound necessity to try to reform systems of evaluation so that we fulfill our ministries responsibly. I will now provide 3 observations from the course reading. The first arrives from the discussion of pastoral accountability, derived from the chapter that you wrote, Dr. Swain and Kyra, about pastoral accountability. Of particular interest is the idea of accountability, as you discuss, as the integration and owning of an ethical point of view, and the way you perceive the development of one's moral character in childhood and one's ethical systems in adulthood being shaped over a developmental process. You spent some time in your chapter reviewing actually some Freudian analysis, which I found quite interesting, discussing how in one's childhood and in one's infancy, in one's toddlerhood, if I could put it that way, there is the witnessing of the parents, the father and of the mother, as the classical imagers of a moral system or of a moral code, and that these are defined by shoulds and oughts, as you point out, and not necessarily always by shame, although that can and does regrettably happen. And of course, according to a Freudian system, this would deal with an Oedipal complex and an Electra complex for men and women. Obviously, you mentioned feminist critiques of these Freudian systems of moral development. And you also point out the way in which some of these moral perspectives can lead to moralism, where, in essence, one still has this overbearing inner critic, as in the case of Marie, the Anglican deacon, who is perpetually haunted by an inferiority complex because of her experiences undergoing this harsh development without fatherly affirmation. Of course, home situations are far more complicated than these classical models, and you also make reference to that in your writing as well. Of interest was the limits of pastoral confidentiality, particularly in the case of Robert, whom you mentioned, a bishop who seems to have been overhearing the case of a man with suicidal ideation, and his concern to keep the reports he was hearing confidential, even though it was, as you accurately pointed out, beyond his scope of expertise to continue to listen, and although it was necessary, fundamentally necessary, for him to seek that parishioner's assistance. Further interest, of course, is this idea of avoiding a church which is characterized by external niceness without authentic accountability, the illusion of openness without authentic communication. And these are all points which, of course, are perennial and exist among us at all times and at all places. But the idea of limits of confidentiality I find fascinating because of, once again, my Roman Catholic background and questions about the seal of the confessional, the sacrament of reconciliation, where obviously the priest, upon hearing the confession of the penitent, is supposed to keep the information entirely private. And legally, we know of some states here in America which are now demanding that some of those confessions actually go publicly. So whether this is or is not a good development is outside of the purview of my future role as a Lutheran pastor, as I'm not under the exact same constraints of confidentiality in the confessional. However, I will argue this. Those same questions will arise. Parishioners can and will come to me with information, and I will be placed in moral dilemmas, whether to maintain that confidentiality or whether to intervene for the safety of those involved. And that's why your excellent discussion of this particular case study was particularly moving to me and particularly eye-opening. This is true because even while a seminarian, I have encountered plenty of situations where people have come and confided in me challenges and difficulties, and the desire, like Marie, the Anglican deacon whom you've mentioned, on some of their part to approach me as though I were a professional licensed counselor, therapist, or even someone to whom they could offer penitential confessions to. And I've had to remind these childhood colleagues and friends, for whom there's total anonymity, of course, that obviously I am first only a student. Secondarily, there are limitations to my expertise. And thirdly, there are avenues, of course, for professional support. And as a learner right now, I'm simply in the capacity of someone who is about the process of discovering how I can best serve my flock when I receive my pastoral posting. And that's one element that I think you brilliantly mentioned in this Cairo article, is, once again, the limitations of not just confidentiality, but also to the expression, the fascination that we have with accountability generally. Moralism, as an overbearing ideological framework, is something which I find in American sociological frameworks often gets imposed upon voices which are seemingly more conservative. But I have encountered certainly rigorous liberal forms of moralism as well. And even if we claim to be a so-called, in air quotes, progressive denomination in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, there can be a sense in which the culture's consensus of morality, or the perceived normative forms of morality in any given body take shape. And what I find is the heroism of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who stood up against the wounded aspects of the perceived social status quo in the American Deep South, or those who stood up like Dietrich Bonhoeffer against the perceived accountability blindly to the moralism of the fascist state, or the bravery of Martin Luther himself standing up against the perceived blind accountability to, at that time, the Western Roman Church. So there are, once again, limitations to accountability that historically can and do exist on a macro level. On a micro level, with Robert, in the case that you gave, that was, I think, beautifully given. We are accountable. We are accountable ethically and morally. And yet at the same time, where are those elements of accountability limited? The other element of our discussion was on the question of grief. And the work by William Wharton on practices of grief in development and counseling was interesting in that there was a distinction given between a grief therapy and grief counseling. And that there's a temptation in some medical fields, seemingly in Wharton's wording, a lot of alliteration there, to perceive perhaps one's grieving process after the loss of a loved one as being pathological nature, rather than a natural process which we all undergo. Interesting to me that there was another Freudian quote that things like melancholia, mold word for depression, was not to be touched, meaning in essence that processes of letting go are all a part of our process of life, our development of life. Fascinating terminology was given about the need for some professionals who are involved in this counseling work to do so within the home and not within a clinical professional setting, such as an office, etc. And to attempt quite meaningfully to attempt to try and encounter people within an appropriate time frame. They'll still be numb right after the loss of a loved one if they've passed, and to give them time to express themselves. In cases of those who do experience psychosis, breaks from reality, etc., particularly those individuals such as those who are widowed, who did not have a good support system and don't have a lot of family support around them. with ideas of accountability, a lot of this was definitely ringing a bell as I was reading this piece, because already we could see here the limitations of that journey. One is to help them through the grieving process, but after that, there is, in some sense, a conclusion of ways in which the individual can now reorientate themselves in relationship to their deceased loved one and in relationship to the world around them. It also is fascinating to me in the overall sense where I perceive limitations in regards to what we can expect. The document says not everyone benefits from grief counseling, which I thought was interesting. It's better if they seek it themselves. So why is it interesting to me overall in light of our discussions? I obviously come from a Roman Catholic background before my ELCA Lutheran background now, but I do have family friends from Tel Aviv, Israel. They are not practicing in their Jewish faith per se, although some rituals do carry over, and among them, in some limited cases, is the practice of sitting Shiva, which I saw growing up in Lower New York with many members of Jewish congregations and many local synagogues whose houses and friends I basically became enmeshed in my growing up process. And sitting Shiva was something I witnessed quite frequently, where after the death of a loved one within that Jewish context, the rabbinical context, the family sits together in mourning, they share stories together, they go through the grieving process together, they allow themselves to feel what they need to feel in order to allow the individual to be passed on. And if we think of death, particularly in my background, within the experience of going to the church, the funeral, going to the cemetery, having the wake, having a big Irish party afterwards, usually at the pub, these rituals also acted, as the article by Worden pointed out, as helpful sociological means of a part of that letting go process. I do think with the collapse of traditional family structures, once again, I'm not here giving an evaluative judgment about that. I'm here speaking clinically and professionally about just the fact that, that there's just a difference in the patterning of the way people are encountering life situations. And in light of current trends towards tribalism around the political sphere rather than the familial sphere, we are not so much speaking of, for example, my mother's maiden name was Brennan, not so much the Brennan clan in Ireland, for example, but more of what party you belong to. I find there to be a lot of social dysfunctionality in the way people are interacting with each other in the Western world, an increase of hostility, suspicion, violence, and this seems to be clearly understood across the board, even as there is an increase of supposed sensitivity to those on the margins like myself, or who I'm visually impaired. I would argue that when it comes to accountability, the tricky part is perceiving others having the same morality as we do. And the narrative in John, particularly the 4th chapter of memory serves me, of Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well, is rather than moralism, rather than imposing a system upon her, he begins a dialogue based off of what they have in common, which is a drink of water. And that is incredibly important. I find in my dialogues, particularly in the metropolitan area, in the tri-state area, where there's a diversity of religious expressions, faiths and non-faith, as a representative of Jesus Christ and my seminarian role, and as someone serving often as an assistant minister in a parish level, as a Eucharistic minister, etc., I often find that meeting people where they're at, and friends, colleagues even, hearing where they are at, is formally most important, because it's one thing for me to speak of, moral codes and ethical systems which I am accountable to, which of course I am accountable to scripturally and denominationally, professionally, and as you point out, personally. But it's another hearing where other people are accountable and to hear their accountability systems. So that was critically important to me, and I think excellently portrayed Dr. Swain in your Kyra piece.